Deshidelay. Welcome to the Awam Tibetan Buddhist Institute and our Sunday meditation hour. Today we are doing a Dharma talk on the preliminary practices. The preliminary practices, often referred to as Nundro, silent G, N-G-O, and so it is representing what is preliminary to everything else that we do in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And it is the way that we start our practices with the practice manual. And so we are going to first invite the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to join us this morning and with the sound of the conch, and then we will do the actual preliminary practices. So we begin on page 1 of the practice text there. Om Sambara Sambara Bhimana Sara Maha Zambaba Humpe Soha. Om Sambara Sambara Bhimana Sara Maha Zambaba Humpe Soha. Om Sambara Sambara Bhimana Sara Maha Zambaba Humpe Soha. Homage to Samittabhadra and Samittabhadri, because I suffer due to my own actions and I now have this precious human life without knowing when I will die, I will now engage in virtuous actions for the benefit of all sentient beings with joy and devotion. Therefore, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, in order to enable all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. May all other sentient beings, boundless as the sky, have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow, and may they rest in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. May all other sentient beings, boundless as the sky, have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow, and may they rest in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. May all other sentient beings, boundless as the sky, have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow, and may they rest in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. Vajrasattva and Vajratopa appear above me, purifying me and all beings and phenomena with nectar from the place of their union. So we maintain the visualization as we recite the mantra on the next page. Om Benza Sato Samaya Manubalaya Benza Sato Tinopa Tishtadrido Me Bawa Sutokayo Me Bawa Supokayo Me Bawa Anurakto Me Bawa Sarva Siddhi Me Prayata Sarva Karma Sutta Me Titim Shri Akuru Hom Ha 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 Ho Bhagavan Sarva Tata Gata Benza Bame Mutsa Benzi Bawa Mahasamaya Sato Om Benza Sato Samaya Manubalaya Benza Sato Tinopa Tishtadrido Me Bawa Sutokayo Me Bawa Supokayo Me Bawa Anurakto Me Bawa Sarva Siddhi Me Prayata Sarva Karma Sutta Me Titam Shri Guru Hom Ha 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 Ho Bhagavan Sarva Tata Gata Benza Mame Mutsa Benzi Bawa Mahasamaya Sato Om Benza Sato Samaya Manubalaya Benza Sato Tenopa Tishtadrido Me Bawa Sutokayo Me Bawa Supokayo Me Bawa Anurakto Me Bawa Sarva Siddhi Me Prayata Sarva Karma Sutta Me Titam Shri Akuru Hom Ha 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 Ho Bhagavan Sarva Tata Gata Benza Mame Munza Benzi Bawa Mahasamaya Sato Mandala offering. Om Ahom in the Dharmakaya pure realm, Dharmadhatu equality, the realms of the five Sambhogakaya families self-appear unobstructedly, along with the array of Namanikaya pure realms that fill all of space. All this I offer as Samattabhadra's clouds of great bliss. Om Radha Mandala Puja Nega Samudra Saparana Samaya Om. Short 7-line prayer. Whatever merit I have gathered through prostrations, offerings, confession, rejoicing, requesting, and praying for the sake of the enlightenment of all sentient beings, all this I dedicate. 7-line prayer, Guru Yoga. Home, in the northwest of the land of Oregon, in the heart of a lotus flower, endowed with the most marvelous attainments, you are renowned as the lotus born, surrounded by many hosts of dakinis. Following in your footsteps, I pray to you, come and bless me with your grace. Guru and City Home. Home, in the northwest of the land of Oregon, in the heart of a lotus flower, endowed with the most marvelous attainments, you are renowned as a lotus born, surrounded by many hosts of dakinis. Following in your footsteps, I pray to you, come and bless me with your grace. Guru Pema City Home. Home, in the northwest of the land of Oregon, in the heart of a lotus flower, endowed with the most marvelous attainments, you are renowned as a lotus born, surrounded by many hosts of dakinis. Following in your footsteps, I pray to you, come and bless me with your grace. Guru Pema City Home. Now we recite the mantra. Om Ahum Benza Guru Pema City Home. 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 Om City Home, Om Ahum, Benzagur Open the 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 City Home. Continue top of page 3. Light radiates from the Guru's 4 places into my 4 places, purifying my body, speech, mind, and all subtle obscurations, granting the 4 empowerments and planting the 4 seeds. The Guru dissolves into light and merges inseparably into myself. So now we dissolve the visualization, rest in the natural state of pure awareness. If any thoughts or other distractions arise, just let them go and refocus your attention on pure awareness. So we'll meditate this morning for about 10 minutes. So there you have it. We just did the intro. Any questions? All right, so we're going to go through in a similar way to the way that we were looking at Garib Dorje's 3 statements, where we're going to really look at individual pieces in a word-for-word kind of an assessment of that. But before we get into that, I thought I would mention at least one thing before we get started, that is the hands. And people do it differently. A lot of times people will fold the hands only for the refuge prayer. Other times people do it for other parts of it. I tend to do it for the whole thing because I think it's really special. But the way you do the hands together is that it's hollow in the middle. It represents the bud of a lotus flower. So it's about to explode into that whole flower. It's not with your hands flat together the way that you would do it when you're reciting namaste to somebody as a greeting or a goodbye kind of a thing, as is typically done in India. So it's a little bit different than that. So keep that in mind. But it's up to you when and where you actually want to fold the hands in terms of the process. But I wanted you to be aware of the way that I typically do it here so that you know. And you can follow that or not. Either way is up to you. So when we look at it, and if you have a copy of this, you can go through and see where I am on this. But it starts out with the conch, and I blew the conch. Occasionally I forget to do that, but usually blow the conch at the beginning as an invitation of all the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas to join us as a part of that. And that kind of sets the stage for what we're about to do. When we do practices, in most of the practices in the Tibetan tradition, we do it in the context of a mandala. And that mandala includes all the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas who have been invited to participate with us. And so with the sound of the conch, it's a symbolic way of bringing all of those together so that in our mind, which is what is important here, all those Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are with us. In this particular context, we have all these beautiful Thangka paintings around, and that kind of adds to the environment of that as well. And so it's traditional to invite them. It's just done in different ways. So sounding the conch is just one of the ways to do that. It's not actually a part of the Nundro itself. And then the blessing mantra, which also is not a part of the formal Nundro itself, but it's something that His Holiness Khenchen Lama Rinpoche had us do in his prayer book, and so I carried that over into ours that we are doing here. And so it reads, Om Sambara Sambara Bhimana Sara Mahazambaba Hum Pe Soha. And it's repeated 3 times. So what does it mean? Well, sometimes it's referred to as a blessing mantra. So here, as we do it here, it's referred to in the text as a blessing mantra, to bring blessings from the invited guests that we already invited through the conch, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Or it is also sometimes called the multiplying mantra, which means that it multiplies the merit of the practice that follows. So I kind of look at it as both and, It's something that brings the blessings from those who are the invited guests and also multiplies the effect of what we are doing. And so what follows that is a version of the preliminary practices, the Nundro. There are variations of those in most sadhanas. Most sadhana practices, sadhanas are a practice text. And so most of those sadhanas will have some part of Nundro included in there. It may just be the refuge prayer, for example. But sometimes they got the refuge prayer and a verse related to bodhicitta, or they may have other kinds of verses in there as a part of that as well. But there are 2 main parts to Nundro. The first one is referred to as the common Nundro, and the second as the uncommon Nundro. The idea is that the first part, the common Nundro, is common to all Buddhist traditions. In one way or another, all Buddhist traditions do this in some way, not necessarily as a set of there's 4 aspects. They don't necessarily do all of them at the same time in those 4 aspects, but they're all embedded in the tradition in some way. Whereas the uncommon Nundro is a little bit different, and that it does actually have some parts that are also done. I'm not sure exactly where those divisions came about over time, because some of those things are included in all traditions, whereas other parts of it are not. So the common Nundro is called sometimes the four thoughts that turn the mind. And so these are, broadly speaking, suffering is one, karma, which are intentional actions, cause and effect kind of things. Precious human life is the third one. So we have this rare opportunity to be born as a human being, so we need to take advantage of this. So the Buddha taught, and his teachings are still available to us. A little bit later we'll look at a couple of metaphors that help explain some of the way of looking at why this is a precious life. And then the fourth one is impermanence and death. Everything is subject to change. Okay? And sometimes we say the only thing permanent is change itself. But even that is subject to change. The idea of what change is changes. And so at some point we're also going to die. And that's one of the givens in life, is that we are all going to die in one way or another, ending this precious opportunity. So that is the reason it is precious. One of the reasons is because we are going to lose this opportunity at some point. And so change can, of course, be good or bad. Well, not all change is bad, so we need to keep that in mind, at least as we're talking about it here. In terms of death, there were two primary views in India at the time of the Buddha. One is referred to as nihilism. Nihilism is that there's nothing beyond this life. You live, you die, that's it, period. And the second one is one which it's usually referred to as permanence, but there is some kind of a continuation, a rebirth, or you go to some place that's a special, like a Buddha field or a heaven somewhere, or you relate with a god of some form or other as a part of that. And so those were kind of the two views. It's either a very limited kind of thing that happens and it's over with, or it's something that in some way continues, either through a rebirth process, so we're reborn and we go through another life and so forth, or we go to some kind of a special sacred place, if you will, and spend time there. So those were the two kind of views. Now, some of the descriptions of these terms can be a little bit troubling. The Nundro terms can be a little bit troubling to people in the West, such as those found in the Words of My Perfect Teacher. If you've read that text, it's a little bit negative in the way that it looks at a lot of things. In fact, Patrul Rinpoche, who wrote that text, was a great master. I mean, he was the commentator on the Three Statements of Garib Dorje that we looked at. Did a wonderful job with that. But his own teacher even said he had a bit of a hard approach to some of what he did there. Still, this is the best known and the most commonly used of the text, particularly in the Nyingma tradition that we follow. And so there are some others. So let's look then at the very first part of this, the four thoughts that turn the mind, the common Nundro. So these four principles, as I said, are common to all Buddhist traditions in one way or another. They may be articulated in different ways, but this approach is common within the Tibetan Buddhist lineages. As I noted, there are four principles here said to turn the mind towards Dharma. So that is the basic idea. These are forms of contemplation, and by doing these contemplations, it encourages us to move in the direction of the Dharma, to practice the Dharma, and so forth. Now, there is an element of fear in the way some of these things are described. It can scare you into doing these things, which doesn't always go over real well in the West these days, but it can be effective, and it was perhaps more effective in earlier times where these things came about initially. So even in some situations today, it can be effective. COVID going around, and we think about COVID and the potential dangers and risks associated with COVID. That seems to trigger a little bit of fear, at least in some people, not everyone. But it is something that maybe can help give us a sense of what it is that is being addressed here in these texts and why they are written in the way that they are. Others prefer a more positive approach, as I said, so there's no need to be concerned about that. The important point is to be motivated. That's what they're all about, to motivate us to follow the path and to practice. So there's many benefits for a wide variety of people here. We can have different views about this and still come together in terms of the purpose, doing the practice, learning about these things, and how they can improve our life in this lifetime, if not in a potential future life, if there is one. And so we start the text with homage to Samittabhadra and Samittabhadri. So it's customary to pay homage to one or more of the Buddhas at the beginning of a text. Some texts don't actually do that, but it is one of the kind of standard things. And so you'll often see that in different practice texts as a part of that. So one or more of the Buddhas, the teachers, or some other significant figure. It could be, for example, Padmasambhava, in some way he's related to the text that you are doing, or to the Nyingma lineage, for example. And then here, Samittabhadra and Samittabhadri represent the heart essence of Buddhism. In the Thangka painting over here in the center, you can see an image of the two of them together. And literally they represent the Dharmakaya, which means truth body, although we're not really talking about a body per se, but it is a part of several collections of these things, the most common one being the one related to the three kayas, three bodies. And so Dharmakaya is one of those. And so Samittabhadra and Samittabhadri in the Nyingma tradition represent that ultimate Dharmakaya, or ultimate Buddha form, if you will. So Samittabhadra specifically represents the masculine principle, which is skillful means, things like loving kindness, compassion, altruism, all those kind of things that relate to this life. The relative aspect is the term that is often used of practice. His consort, Samittabhadri, there represents the feminine principle, or transcendent wisdom. Now, not all Buddhist traditions use the term transcendent wisdom. They all do use wisdom, but there are various forms of wisdom that are addressed in different traditions. In our tradition, we tend to focus on the transcendent wisdom, and in fact, most of the Tibetan Buddhist forms do that. It comes actually out of the Mahayana tradition, and so Tibetan Buddhism is actually a part of the Mahayana tradition, even though it's sometimes stacked up as being a separate from the Mahayana. It actually is a part of that. And so that term, transcendent, beyond words, beyond concepts, is also represented in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So it also symbolizes the absolute or ultimate aspect of our practice. And those are two terms that you will see depicted a lot as a part of that. The two of them, Samittabhadra, Samittabhadri, are often depicted as being in union, which is like two aspects of the same thing. And so I think of them as being in the form of a single statue. I didn't bring a statue to show you today, but when you see the two of them together in a statue, for example, it is a single statue. It's not two things sitting side by side or somehow clumped together. It's a single statue. And so I think that's an important part. It looks like two figures, but in fact, it's one. Okay? One object in and of itself. It can't be divided or separated from each other. So symbolically, when we think about the things that are the ultimate and the relative aspects of Buddhism, it's the same thing. And we can talk about them as separate, Samittabhadra, Samittabhadri, but the reality is they are one taste. Okay? They're really one thing, just different aspects of that one thing. And what is that one thing? It is Buddhahood. So when we think about that, we don't want to get caught up too much in, oh, it's this or oh, it's that, because ultimately they really come together as one. So the next phrase that is in the text there is because I suffer. So suffering is the first of the four thoughts that turn the mind. Dukkha is the word in Sanskrit that is usually used as a part of that, and it's usually translated as suffering. And so we see that word a great deal. However, particularly more modern scholars have found through their investigation that it's not really suffering per se. It's not that suffering's not included, but that's only a part of a bigger picture of what the word dukkha actually refers to. And so the stories of the Buddha make it clear that he was talking about a much broader topic: discontent, dissatisfaction, and so forth. And so suffering, of course, can cause discontent, dissatisfaction. So it is a part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And so it's important for us today to keep that in mind as we really look at what is Buddhism about. It's not just about suffering, which has a kind of negative connotation to it. It's much bigger than that. And so the other terms also have a somewhat negative aspect to them. But the idea is to overcome that. And we can do that in various ways. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at. So why can't we all just get along? Okay? That's kind of what the essence of what this is saying, for example. And then Tibetan teachings list 3 general types of sufferings. There are others that are listed in the Pali tradition and so forth. But one is physical pain and mental obscurations. That comes pretty close to the meaning of the word suffering in English. Okay? Physical pain, yeah, that's a form of suffering. Mental obscurations, anxiety, things like that, that's a form of suffering as well. But research shows that meditation, not just Buddhist forms, can be helpful for both of these. So the research shows, yeah, you can reduce the amount of physical pain that somebody experiences. You can help people deal with anxiety and other kinds of mental issues through doing meditation. And not just Buddhist forms of meditation. Any form of meditation can be helpful in that process. And so we're starting to see meditation applied in lots of secular kinds of environments and not just in Buddhism. Some Buddhists don't like that very well. They feel like, wait a minute, you're avoiding some of the issues here of what we should be using and should be applying. And it would certainly be good if we did that. One of the effects of that discussion, the Dalai Lama, and he was very influential, and some others have brought out that one of the things that's missing in a lot of the mindfulness training, for example, a form of meditation, is that it lacks any kind of ethical position. So is it ethical, for example, to train somebody as a sniper to be a better sniper, killing people, and avoiding the ethics involved in that? Okay. So those are the kind of issues that do come up as a part of the discussion related to this. But we can't always eliminate all of the suffering related to those. So it's important to keep that in mind. So the second form, beyond in the 3 related to Tibetan Buddhism, is a dissatisfaction from change. So there's that word again. Change is a very important word in our tradition and in Buddhism generally. So sometimes we say change is inevitable, change will happen. And so sometimes we don't get what we want. Things change and we wanted something and that's not the way it worked out for us. And so we're unhappy about that. Or we get what we want, but that didn't work either. It's still dissatisfying. It's not entirely, we don't entirely develop a sense of contentment with what we did get as a part of that. And so those kind of things with change, it's inevitable. Sometimes we're happy about getting those things. Sometimes we're unhappy about getting those things. Sometimes we're happy about it, but then it turns unhappy on us. So those are also another form of dissatisfaction that can happen as a form of suffering. A third one is an all-encompassing form of change, and this is really the one that the Buddha tended to emphasize more so than the other two. A very broad and almost a vague sense of general dissatisfaction as a part of that. Life just isn't quite like we expect it to be. We're seeing a lot of that these days. COVID vaccine, the stuff that's going on in Afghanistan and other places around the world and so forth. There's a lot of very negative kinds of things going on, and it can be very discomforting. What about world peace? I thought we were working toward world peace. So that's the kind of thing that Buddhism is probably best at, and the kind of thing that the Buddha was most importantly addressing as a part of this. And so the idea, this is one of the things, it's done as a contemplation, and there are texts that give us exact guidelines on what to do to contemplate suffering in many, many different forms. And as a result of that, encourage us to practice Buddhism specifically as a part of that. One other point about all-encompassing change before we go on is that sometimes this is expressed in a little bit different way, which is suffering on suffering. And so in that context, what's being referred to is we may be experiencing suffering, and while we're experiencing that suffering, here comes something else, and then something else, and it just stacks one on top of the other, and things just get worse and worse and worse. And sometimes that happens. So that's another view that's sometimes discussed in terms of these different forms of suffering about this. So as a part of that, because I suffer due to my own actions, so the text goes on and says, oh, there's a cause, a reason for that suffering, my own actions. What actions are we talking about here? We're talking about karmic actions, if you will. So this is where this comes into play. In Buddhism, generally, we're referring to intentional actions. It's not just anything we do. Sometimes we make mistakes, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, I intend to do this, and I go ahead and I do that. That kind of an action is what we're addressing here. And so that means that we have to think about, well, what kind of actions are okay or good, and what kind of actions maybe are not. And that's where ethics works into this action. So it has primarily to do with ethics and how our actions affect others, or vice versa. A lot of times we don't think, when we think about ethics, we don't really think about it's about two people or more. But if it was only one person, if it was only you, what would be the point of ethics? Okay? Not harming some other person. There wouldn't be any other person to harm in the first place. Okay? So there would be no point of ethics at all. So it's about relationships with other people or other sentient beings. We go beyond just human beings here. And so, are we doing good or bad is the question. Or are we doing right or wrong? And how do we know? So ethics is about these kind of relationships and some kind of rules or guidelines associated with that. So as a general rule in Buddhism, that's easy to recall and apply, is one that says, do good or at least do no harm for the benefit of all beings. Now there's lots of lists and other kind of things that we can look at, and we'll look at one of those here in just a moment, that give us more specific kind of guidelines. But this is one that's really easy to keep in mind in terms of making these kinds of choices, these kinds of decisions. Do good or at least do no harm. Okay? It's a little easier to distinguish than is it good or bad. Okay? Harm is a more specific kind of a context that we can look at. Doesn't always work out. Sometimes we tend to do good, but something harmful happens out of that. And that will happen, and we can't help it. But if that happens, then we regret that that happens. And there are actual practices that we can do in order to offset that. One of them was the practice that we did this morning of Vajrasattva. Okay. purification kind of a practice that we can do to offset that. But do good, or at least do no harm, for the benefit of all beings. And remember, it's about that intention. So that is the most important part of this. But our intention does need to be genuine, not superficial. There may also be an issue of making some sacrifices as a part of this, because we're trying to do things for the benefit of other people. Okay? That might mean that we have to sacrifice some things that we would desire to have in order to do that. We may have to, if we intend to be altruistic and give something. Maybe I see somebody that's homeless on the street and they're asking for money, and so I have to give some of my money that I could use for something for me, and I give it to them because it's going to be more beneficial to that person. Okay, so we make these sacrifices. They can be small sacrifices. In the texts, they can get pretty extreme, like giving our own body and so forth. Typically, the Buddha didn't tell us to do that extreme of a version. That tends to come out of the later Mahayana version of those kind of things. But there are forms of sacrifices, and it's important that we think about doing those kind of things, how difficult that might be for ourselves. But the focus needs to be on other beings. I mentioned the term altruism, and the definition of altruism is doing something for the benefit of someone else without expecting anything in return. You know, we have a tendency to, the phrase, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. We expect something in return for the things that we do for other people. Or some people even talk about keeping score. You know, I've done these 2 things for you, I expect you to do 2 things back good for me, and so forth. And so that's part of our cultural tradition. That's not part of Buddhism. We do it because that's the right thing to do. Sometimes it doesn't work out. We can do things, other things, and make it better. We need to learn from those experiences. If it doesn't work out, maybe next time it will, but maybe next time we could do it a little differently too, and it'd be more likely to work out. Sometimes it's just beyond anything we can actually do. Okay? I can't stop the war in Afghanistan. I have no ability whatsoever. I might say some prayers and that kind of thing, but physically I can't just stop the war. And that's okay. We do the best we can. But it's okay to feel some compassion or sorrow about what's going on, like what's going on in Afghanistan, like what's going on with all the people suffering from COVID virus, not only in Arizona, but in the United States, in other countries, all around the world. So those are the kind of things that's a part of it. Compassion is one of the most important aspects of what Buddhism is all about. So we need to feel that. It's again about other people and the connections, relationships with other people, even if they're not in our immediate environment. So the next part of the verse goes on to say, and now I have this precious human life. A more good aspect than the last 2. So there are a number of factors that constitute being a precious human life, what makes it precious. One is that we are human because of our ability to make conscious choices, to be able to communicate in a form of language. Lots of other beings can communicate. Even trees have ways of communicating things with each other. But we're the only species that can actually communicate in a language, though some come pretty close to that. Some birds have songs that actually communicate with others. Dolphins have their own kind of chitter chatter, and whales and so forth. So there's lots of forms of communication, but we're the only ones that speak in the kind of language that we have, which gives us an advantage in terms of trying to be able to do these kind of things. So we are in a better state than most other life forms, and to use our time and abilities that we have for full awakening,
is the term that is sometimes used. Sometimes we refer to enlightenment, sometimes we refer to realization, sometimes we refer to liberation, and so forth. So there's a number of different words that we talk about here, and even awakening is sometimes differentiated by awakening versus full awakening as a part of that. But we won't go into the details of that right now. We have also been born at the time the Buddha lived. So in long term, Buddhism usually uses the term eon, during an eon of time, a very long period of time. The Buddha lived and taught the Dharma. So that makes this time something very advantageous to us. If he hadn't been here, he hadn't taught the Dharma, how could we go learn his teachings? They wouldn't be here to learn. Okay? And so his teachings have also then survived into our times. Not perhaps in the best way that we would like, because they didn't actually have a formal written language, the form of language that we have today of letters used to make words and so forth. They did have, you might call it a hieroglyphic, they use a different term, but it's like the hieroglyphics in Egypt as written forms, but it wasn't able to express things in the way that we're able to express things with our more modern forms of language. And so the text didn't get written down for 200-300 years after the time of the Buddha. Okay? They didn't have a way to write them down, and that was a part of it. But they did have a very strong oral tradition of memorizing and reciting and repeating these things over and over. And that's why, as a part of our tradition, particularly in the monastic tradition, they memorize these texts and they recite them over and over and over. And that is their main practice, is memorizing and reciting over and over and over. Whereas in the West, our education is more focused on things like critical thinking, analysis, and being able to really examine. Now, it's not that they don't do that. In the higher levels of their training, they do that kind of thing as well. But it is a little bit different approach. But it's been beneficial to us, because by the time things actually did get written down, we're talking about India now, a very humid climate, and what did they write them on? For the most part, palm leaves. Got any palm leaves around your house here? How well do they'll survive? How long do they last? Okay? And it turns out that for the most part they may last, they wrote on them 100, 200, sometimes maybe 300 years. How long has it been since then? 2,500 years. So we don't have those as a source. The earliest form of actual writing that we have was about the time writing actually first started to become available, which was the time of Ashoka, around 250 BCE. And he became a Buddhist, and he sent out, after conquering most of the Indian subcontinent, he sent out missionaries, some as far away as Greece and Egypt and so forth. And in some of these places around the border of the areas he had conquered, he had them put up these steels, or they carved sayings in rocks and so forth that still survive today. And so that actually is the earliest actual existent form of texts of the Buddhist teachings that we have today. Now, there are some more toward about the beginning of the new millennium. For example, they're finding texts, for the most part, written on birch bark that were stored away in northern Afghanistan, in the area, though, at that time known as the Gandharan Empire. It wasn't a huge empire, but it was in the area that we might know as the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan. But that's a much drier climate. And they would put them in these clay jars and bury them, and most of what they've been able to find is in this one hillside where they were put away as reliquaries for people to recognize people who had died. And they would have texts written down on these birch bark things, folded up, put into these jars, and then they buried those jars. And many of those have survived. They're just beginning to get those texts and just beginning to understand the Gandhari language itself. For a long time, they didn't know what it was, and they figured it out. Interestingly enough, diverting just a little bit here. That came about because somebody recognized a pattern of a word. Oh, here's this word, here's this word, here's this word, here's this word. I recognize that pattern. Well, the pattern that was recognized came from a sutra in the Pali language. And it was called the Rhinoceros Sutra. And the word was rhinoceros. Okay? Well, now they had a match. It's like the Rosetta Stone, if you will. They had a match. They knew this was the word. They knew it. Pattern was exactly the same. And so, oh, then this word must mean such and such, and this word must mean such and such. And it gave them the start of that. Once they had that, then they go to other texts, and they could find, oh, okay, this means this means that. Oh, must mean something else. And now they have a dictionary of these things, and they're beginning to translate these as they find them. So that's also one of the earliest forms of that. The Pali tradition, which actually evolved at about the same time, the only text, the earliest text, actual texts we have from there are 1800s. There's some fragments from the 1700s. I saw something the other day that they have found some as early as 1500. That's fairly recent. Okay? And so these are the kind of issues that we have in terms of knowing what did the Buddha actually say as a part of that. And scholars are trying to figure it out. Just to go ahead and give you my answer to this, because we could easily say, why bother? All right? We don't really know what he said. Who cares? My answer to that is all of these things are helpful to us. As long as they are helpful to us, that is a reason to follow this tradition. And there are variations, of course, in how people understand and interpret those. And you can find one that fits for you. For me, it's been the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But for other people, it could be one of the Pali traditions or one of the other Mahayana traditions, like Zen or Pure Land or one of those. Anyway, going back to the explanation here of the precious human life, I also mentioned, well, before I get to that, one last thing here. The Buddha proclaimed when he attained his enlightenment, if you will, profound peace, natural simplicity, uncompounded luminosity. I have found the nectar-like Dharma. That's why we should follow his guidelines, his instructions as a part of that. So there are also a couple of stories. One of them is the blind turtle you may have heard about, and to give an example of how precious life is. And so the story of the blind turtle is that he lived at the bottom of the ocean. He is blind after all. He lived at the bottom of the ocean. And once every 100 years, he would come to the surface of that ocean. On that surface, blown about by wind and waves and so forth, was a yoke. And the opportunity of this precious life is the same as the probability that that turtle, when it comes up once every 100 years on this vast ocean, pokes his head right through the yoke. Okay? Infinitesimally small. Very, very tiny. Now, if you think about that in terms of the way we might view our lives and our opportunities and being here and think, well, I'm here. That doesn't really apply to me. Well, let's look at it from the point of view of our current existence. What's the chance of being born at all? Consider the odds of one particular sperm out of the 20 billion produced by your father in a lifetime. Only one. And your mother, which typically would produce between 300 and 500 eggs in a lifetime. So you've got 1 in 20 billion, 1 in 3 to 500, those exact two coming together and being you. That's the probability of just your current mother and father. If anything was a little bit different, a different egg, a different sperm, it would have been a brother or a sister. but not you. Okay? But that's only one generation. If we just look at modern life and the existence of life as humans on this earth, there have been somewhere in the area of 2,250 different generations. In some cases it's going to be a lot more, some cases it's going to be less than that, but give or take it's going to be in that area. And so if you multiply all those things together, I don't even know the word for the number that this is, but it's 13.5 with 4 sets of 3 zeros behind it. Million, billion, zillion. I don't know what the number is. It is infinitesimally small, just like the example of the turtle, the blind turtle. Okay? So we need to really appreciate the value of this life that we have. Okay. So we're going to end there today. I actually went over by just a little bit. And so we're going to end with our closing prayers real quickly. As a part of this, we'll just do the wish for bodhicitta. Om Shri Anata Benza Sarva Siddhi Pala Hom. Glorious, precious root Lama, sit on the lotus seat on the crown of my head. With your great kindness, please accept me. Please bestow the realizations of body, speech, and mind. In all the activities of the glorious Lama, may no wrong view arise even for a moment. By the devotion of seeing whatever he or she does as perfect, may the blessing of the Lama enter my mind. Throughout the succession of my lives, from the perfect Lamas, may I never be separated, and enjoying the glory of the Dharma, perfect all the qualities of the stages and the paths, and swiftly attain the stage of Vajradhara. The Lamas who have become the glory of the Dharma, may their lives be stable. May the land entirely filled with doctrine holders, may the wealth and power of the patrons of the doctrine increase, and may the auspiciousness of the doctrine remain forever. Bodhicitta, the excellent and precious mind, where it is unborn, may it arise. Where it is born, may it not decline, but ever increase, higher and higher. Om Mani Padme Hum Shri. Om Mani Padme Hum Shri. Om Mani Padme Hum Shri. I dedicate the merit of this practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. I dedicate the merit of this practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. I dedicate the merit of this practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. Thank you very much for putting up with my long Dharma talk today. Didn't need to go over. So, announcements, we will be continuing this next week. We'll continue where we left off with the Dharma talk as a part of that. We have our Wednesday practice. Tara is coming up this Wednesday, so please consider joining us for that at 6 o'clock in the evening. And we will also be starting a new class coming up pretty soon. For those of you who have a background in the Dharma, we're going to be starting the Essentials 7 class. There's not a prerequisite, but it's certainly helpful if you've had the background of those other courses or have taken those other courses before we do that. It is Dzogchen, and so it's one of the most advanced practices of the Buddhist tradition, and so we will be starting that on the first Sunday of next month. So it's coming up very soon. So please abide softly and deeply in pure awareness and loving kindness and compassion for all sentient beings, always and always. Thank you very much.
Thank you.